Well, thank you all very much for coming. I'm Jim Goldgeier, Dean of the School of International Service, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this event on the Kurds in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and delighted to have such a wonderful panel here to discuss these issues. We're very fortunate at the School of International Service because we have an endowment that's been graciously provided by the Barzani family to help us support events, students, and courses to help enlighten us on issues related to the Kurds, and so it enables us to do things we otherwise would not be able to do. I'm delighted to welcome our panelists. Overseeing this event is Stephen Cook, the Hasib J. Sabag Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Stephen's an expert on Arab and Turkish politics as well as U.S. Middle East policy. His most recent book is The Struggle for Egypt, From Nasser to Tahrir Square, which was published by Oxford University Press in the fall of 2011 and won the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Gold Medal in 2012. He writes the blog From the Potomac to the Euphrates and is also, most importantly, an adjunct professor here at the School of International Service. Henri Barkey is Bernard L. and Bertha F. Cohen Professor of International Relations at Lehigh University. He served as a member of the U.S. State Department Policy Planning Staff, working on issues related to the Middle East, Eastern Mediterranean, and intelligence from 1998 to 2000. And he's taught previously at Princeton, Columbia, SUNY, and the University of Pennsylvania, and is the author, co-author, editor of 5 books, including Turkey's Kurdish Question. And he is going to be directing the Middle East program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And then Denise Natalie is a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, INSS, where she specializes on the Middle East, transborder Kurdish issues, regional energy security, and post-conflict state building. She joined INSS in January 2011 as the Minerva Chair following more than 2 decades of researching and working in the Kurdish regions of Iraq, Turkey, Iran, and Syria. And she is the author of numerous publications on Kurdish politics, economy, and energy. And we're just thrilled to have all 3 of them here with us today. And I look forward to, unfortunately, I always, as is often the case, I get to welcome and then I have to go off to something else, so I look forward to hearing the upshot of the meeting and to watching the video later from the live stream. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I'll speak on behalf of both Henri and Denise. Thank you. And thank you all for coming and spending some time here with us this afternoon. I'm going to start, the way we're going to do this, I'm going to start by asking Henri and Denise a number of questions. And then when I've exhausted my questions, we're going to open it up to all of you for the interactive portion of today's program. But I want to start with asking you both a question, and you guys can decide who wants to answer it first. There are 2 dueling narratives in Washington these days about the Kurds. Just the other day, the Iraqi ambassador to the United States made a statement saying that he did not believe that in the aftermath of the Islamic State crisis that the Kurds would seek independence. At the same time, Emma Skye, who is a British academic an advisor, one-time advisor to the U.S. military in Iraq. It has a book coming out. It's out. She's on a book tour now. Has a piece in the Atlantic magazine about Iraq having become, that essentially Iraq is lost. It is a country of militias, and questioning whether it really is a viable country going forward, which would suggest that this is an opportunity for Iraqi Kurds to realize what has been their, at times explicit, at other times implicit goal of independence. What do you make of those narratives? And do you think that we are closer to an independent Kurdistan in what was formerly Iraq or not? Henri, Denise?
Ladies first.
Thank you. Is this on? Thank you, Stephen. And it's good to be here. Thanks, Henri. I always get a kick out of hearing the Washington narrative. It's almost like this bubble exists. And
do you work in Washington?
I do.
Oh,
and
okay.
I've lived out of the country for 16 of the last 20 years, most of the time out. So when you come back here and you hear some of these narratives, it is quite amusing to hear, as Iraqis say, the Americans kind of want the Iraq to break up more than the Iraqis do. I've heard the Emma Sky narrative. I think a lot of this is pie in the sky. Has nothing. I think there needs to be a differentiation between the sentiments of nationalism, which are extremely strong among all the Kurds, and the realities on the ground. I don't think that there is a Kurd that I know in Iraq, Turkey, Iran, or Syria who wouldn't identify as a Kurd first. Nor is there a strong sense of being Iraqi among the Kurds. However, there are obviously, if you know the geography, this is a landlocked region, so I can talk about first the geopolitical realities, and until that there's a regional state, neither Turkey nor Iran nor Syria, what is of Syria at the moment, that would support a Kurdish state, it's just simply not going to happen. The other option would be you can be a client state or a vassal state of Turkey, and then perhaps we can discuss later. The fallout of ISIS is even made that less likely because of the very strength of Kurdish nationalism. And third would be, what would these territorial boundaries of a Kurdistan region look like? If tomorrow everyone agreed that the Kurdistan state would be Duhok or Bil and Suleimania, I don't actually think there'd be a problem with that. I don't even think that there's an Iraqi Arab who has any problem with that as well, saying you're more than welcome to leave Iraq, you're just not going to take Kirkuk or Mosul. So what would the boundaries of that region be, and would it lead to conflict? And finally, until the region, and I'm not saying that this is impossible, but right now, after 10 years of developing the region's oil sources, 95% of the revenues are still coming from Baghdad, maybe 92. And when you still have that level of financial dependency, it's really hard to go beyond the idea, well, we don't feel Iraqi, and everything's going to break up. I mean, there just is, the people that talk about the breakup and the statehood, they need to live in the region for at least several years to realize there's a lot of pressures against it. And I think Kurdish nationalism is so strong right now that what happened after ISIS, and will be direct, the fact that Turkey did not come to the Kurdistan region's defense when ISIS was coming to Erbil, the fact that Turkey did not come to the defense of Kobani, and the Syrian Kurds watched this, has actually made the alliance with Turkey a liability to some of those Kurds that have to have this alliance. So the Kurds started to have a rethink. Do we really want to be a vassal state of Turkey when they haven't resolved their own Kurdish problem yet? And so I don't want to take up too much time. There's just a lot of issues right now to jump to. Iraq is weak, therefore there is going to be a Kurdish state. It's far, far more complicated than what folks like Emma Sky put in their books.
Okay, well, we have one against. Henri.
It's not even against. I'm not even for or against.
It's not going to happen. Henri, go ahead, please.
It will and it will not happen.
Well done. Well played, sir.
Excuse me. Look, I think there will be some kind of Kurdish independent state at some point. What I can't tell you is when it will happen. I think the way the region is developing, I think the way the states in the region have lost so much control over what is supposed to be, excuse me, the territories they're supposed to be controlling. If you look at Baghdad and if you look at Damascus, Baghdad and Damascus have essentially lost control over the Sykes-Picot boundaries. There's no way Baghdad can essentially extract resources, men for the militaries, taxes from a great large segment of the territory. And the same thing is true for Syria. So that starts a process in which people are doing their own things. And this is not, by the way, just for the Kurds. It has to do with all kinds of different communities that are now quite independent of the central government. The Kurds have, in contrast to the others, essentially a unifying idea, a unifying ethnicity, a unifying government, especially in the KRG, which gives them a sense of direction, a sense of belonging, a sense of who they are. And nationalism is a kind of all-embracing power that, as Denise said, that every single Kurd in the region would like to have an independent Kurdistan. Why not? Except that I think the Kurds are smart enough to realize that they should not go for independence on their own. They should wait for the reason for independence to come to them. And that's the argument that I would make, that independence will eventually come to the Kurds because Baghdad and Damascus are incapable of controlling and managing their own territory. And that in fact, Baghdad's problem is not necessarily with the Kurds, it's mostly with the Sunnis. And as the centrifugal forces in Iraq become stronger and stronger, the point will come where the Kurds will not have a choice but to become independent. So for me, it's a question of process. And I think the Kurds will become independent, but it is not something we can say, oh, it's going to happen by the end of 2015 or 2016 or 2017. I don't know. There are two strong states to date in the region, Iran and Turkey, both of which have their own Kurdish minorities. But both are struggling. Turkey more than Iran at the moment, but I think Iran will also be having problems with its own Kurdish minority as time goes by, as the ideas of Kurdish nationalism propagate. And both of these countries will also look at solutions to their own Kurdish problem, maybe by exporting that problem. And by that I mean, if there is a independent Kurdish state in Iraq, maybe our Kurds will be satisfied.
Okay, I want to follow up with a question for you about Turkey specifically, given your expertise and knowledge in that area. But I want to follow up with both of you on one question. You both have articulated this very, very strong sense of Kurdish nationalism. I have far less experience than either of you in Kurdistan. Yet at the same time you say there is this strong sense, but it will not happen. Articulate again specifically why these other issues will overcome this extraordinarily powerful sense of Kurdish nationalism at a time of the Iraqi state's seemingly maximum weakness and the Syrian state's maximum weakness. Why doesn't that carry through? What are the continuing obstacles in Iraq? In Iraq, why are these things militating against this strong sense of nationalism?
I think one, the Kurds are extremely pragmatic. And I'll say right now, the Kurds in Iraq who have had 2 decades at least of working with international structures, working with international community. I mean, this depends how you think states are sustained, right? I mean, if this idea of nationalism is sustaining it because of your sentiments, but there's the real realities on the ground. And we're not just talking about a state in the Kurdish regions of Iraq. There's a lot of pragmatic issues, and I go back to practicality. This is a region that needs to be stable. It's a quasi-state, right? So if you're a quasi-state, you don't really have external sovereignty, so you need this international recognition. They brought in international oil companies. This whole idea of keeping the region stable, back to the pragmatic decision-making of the Kurdish leaders, means you have to cut a deal with Turkey. I don't know how many of you have lived in the Kurdistan region, but you're landlocked. When somebody closes your border for 2 weeks, there's no food coming in, and your economy breaks down. So that means you're a Kurdish leader, you have to cut a deal with Turkey. You've got to cut a deal with the Iranians. You've got to cut a deal with the Syrians, and I don't care who they are. But that often means that some of these, the nationalist discourse has to be differentiated between how to sustain the realities on the ground, which means this is why this idea of an autonomous revenue source, if many of you have followed, the discourse has been, we need to be economically autonomous. And economic independence does not necessarily mean political independence, because they know. Because they know about these really strong geopolitical realities at the moment. So nationalism, Stephen, as a strong sentiment, in my view, I don't see this as necessarily translating into, we are nationalistic, we need a state.
So you said there are these realities. They need to cut deals. Are you suggesting that if, for example, I mean, we don't know what happens, that there is this, something happens in Iraq, and there is this wellspring of, demands that Barzani declare independence. Is there a concern that there'll be, what kind of consequences? What are specifically the kinds of consequences
Sure.
that stay their hand
Sure.
at that moment?
Sure. Well, again, right now, too, I really can't emphasize enough how fragmented. This is not the 90s when there's a civil war, but there's deep fragmentations right now, which has been exacerbated by Islamic State, so that you have very deep issues between the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. You have the idea that under no conditions do they want to be a vassal state of Turkey. Is there even an issue of, do you have the right to declare Kurdish independence, because we're not going to listen to you? You know what's going on in the Kurdish parliament? There was a fist fight 3 weeks ago because nobody wants Barzani. These folks don't want him to be the president. I have to question that this can be a unilateral decision anymore. This is not, I know we like to say this, Barzani has all the power, and he does, but there really is a dynamic process going on inside the Kurdistan region. So there's a contingent that is strongly affiliated with Iran, or has to be. So it's not just Barzani declares independence. Secondly, again, I think that they're pragmatic enough to say, they tried that, right? What happened? The economy, the people are really suffering economically right now. It's terrible. I know the news likes to put the good story on in the press, but the fact is there is no money. So I don't think, again, what happens if Barzani does it? Well, it depends. Like I said, is he going to say Duhok, Erbil, and Suleimania, or is he going to say Kirkuk is part of the Kurdistan region? And if he does, and this has been told to me yesterday, the Sunni Arabs, he goes, don't worry, we will come and we will kick them out. And so there will be, in my view, not now, because there's ISIS, and this is my biggest concern, it's territorial conflict, and the people who are going to get it are the people living in the disputed territories. The Christians, the Yazidis, those folks. So there will be conflict in those areas that are continuously disputed. It's going to be about borders.
Okay, so what you're saying is the three factors, and then Henri, I'd like you to weigh in this as well, is internal politics, the internal fragmentation of the Kurdish politics within northern Iraq. Two, the question of disputed territories.
It's a big issue.
And three, the fact that they have no money.
For now.
And that they would need Kirkuk in order to generate.
Well, no, I know. Actually, like I said, if they were to have a small Kurdistan, you could have a small, stable Kurdistan. Do you want to have a big Kurdistan that's continuously at odds? And again, the Kurdistan region's new neighbor, or its new border of 1,000 square kilometers, is with Sunni Arab nationalists. Okay, and this is a very big issue.
Okay, Henri?
Look, I think you mischaracterized me earlier in the sense that I actually think that Kurdish independence is coming. What I tried to say was that it wasn't going to come because the Kurds necessarily declared unilaterally independence, but because events in the region will essentially will create the conditions where there is no other choice but to be independent, and especially after ISIS, and ISIS is just one phenomenon in the region. Even if ISIS is defeated tomorrow, there's going to be al-Nusra. If there's al-Nusra defeated, I think the state structure as we know it, especially between Syria and Iraq, has disappeared. So let's not kid ourselves. It's not just about defeating al-Nusra or ISIS. These kinds of groups are there, will exist for a long time to come. And even Kurdish groups, which are independent of both Barzani, the PKK imagines itself essentially as as a new force that will stay in the region as some kind of influential factor. So the state as we know it, at least the existing state structure, has disappeared. So the KRG is going to emerge as an independent state. What I don't know is exactly under what circumstances. Because they are landlocked, they need a patron. And that patron is most likely to be Turkey at the moment. A couple of things that also is important to know is that one of the things that the
Don't
Turks...
talk too much about Turkey, because that's my next question.
Okay. No. That, no. I mean, okay. So one thing that Denise is right about is that the Kurds, when they go independent, they will want Kirkuk. They cannot go independent without Kirkuk, both for emotional reasons and also for economic reasons. So that will be the contentious issue. But Kirkuk is not the Kirkuk of the old days either. I mean, in the sense that there's been a lot of ethnic cleansing. Some of the groups that used to be very powerful in the region are no longer, turn out to be are not really significant, like the Turkomans. So we really don't know how the Kirkuk will be disposed of. But I suspect that Kirkuk will be part of an independent Kurdistan. And an independent Kurdistan, and the important thing here also to realize is that, again, you don't want to talk about Turkey, but I think the Turks may want the KRG to go independent. And that's a critical factor.
Okay, which leads me now to my question about, you'll get a chance, Denise, don't worry. My question about Turkey. There has been a lot going on in Turkey with regard to Turkish Kurds. There was a spat between the Deputy Prime Minister Bülent Arınç and President Erdogan not too long ago over the reports that there was going to be a roadmap for the resolution of the Kurdish issue in Turkey. First thing I'd like for you to do, Henri, is to explain to us the state of play of politics in Turkey related to the Kurds, keeping in mind that we don't have till next week.
Next month?
And how we are 8 weeks away from Turkey's general elections, and that there are expectations among some that the Kurdish party will get the 10% to get into the parliament. What are the dynamics here? What does that mean for a settlement? Second, how does that relate to Kurds in Syria and Iraq? And then I have a follow-up for Denise on that question. Go ahead.
Okay.
You are the master of this, having written Turkey's Kurdish problem. How are they now solving Turkey's Kurdish problem?
Well, on Nevruz, a couple of weeks ago, in Diyarbakir, the main most important Kurdish town in Turkey, you had almost 1 million people waiting to hear a speech that was delivered or read, a speech by Abdullah Öcalan, the guy who created the PKK, who is in jail in some little cozy island in the Marmara Sea. And he sent a speech, and that speech was read to almost 1 million people in a huge square, with people brandishing Kurdish flags, pictures of Öcalan, not a single Turkish flag to be seen anywhere. This is revolutionary. I mean, this is truly revolutionary. That kind of image, I could have never imagined it, forget about 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. So the Turks have traveled a very long distance. And I think the Turkish leadership does deserve a lot of credit for doing that. They did that because they realized that the Kurdish problem, even though the Öcalan had been captured in 1999, did not disappear with a leader going to jail, that in fact this is a very deeply rooted problem, and this is a problem that really threatens Turkey to its core, because the Kurdish problem is not a regional problem, it's a nationwide problem. Istanbul is the largest Kurdish city in the world. It has maybe 2 to 4 million Kurds, we don't know. So given that, the Turkish government very smartly decided to start the peace process. The problem is that there is a major contradiction between what the peace process in Turkey entails, which is not just changing the constitution, recognizing cultural rights, but also the devolution of powers to all the regions of Turkey, and what President Erdogan is trying to achieve, which is a very centralized state, almost centralized around him. So you have two
You don't have
processes.
to use the almost. No need to caveat it.
So, he built his huge palace where he sits there and he wants to control everything from that palace. So that is very contradictory to what the peace process that he started is. So I don't know how he's going to resolve that contradiction, right? He has to prioritize whether or not he wants to be president with huge numbers of powers and also allow a devolution or not allow the devolution. That's not very, very, very clear to me. But I think they have come to a place from which there is no return. So the Kurdish peace process in Turkey has to progress. The Kurds also have made one very significant compromise, and that is that they say very openly, and I think one has to take them at more than face value, that they don't want independence, that they are willing to stay within the boundaries of Turkey, provided they get the three things they want: constitutional change, complete cultural rights, and devolution of power. So that's why Iraqi independence, Kurdish independence, becomes important, because it's a way of if you have a independent Kurdish state in northern Iraq and maybe in Syria, you can satisfy Kurdish feelings for independence and Kurdish statehood and Kurdish nationhood and maintain the Kurds within Turkey. And I think that's the calculation that Erdogan is making in his mind when he started the peace process.
One quick follow-up before I go to Denise on that. You mentioned the three things that the Kurds in Turkey want. They want constitutional reform, they want total cultural rights, and they want devolution of power. How, from where we sit now on April, 9th, how possible do you think it is for them to get those things? Those are very, very hard things. Not just because Erdogan sits in his palace and wants to be the sun around which Turkish politics revolves, but
You said
that. I did say that, and I will use it forever. I'll dine out on that for the next 10 years. Given the kind of tragic encounter between Kurdish and Turkish nationalism, and the fact that the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, has a strong nationalist wing and it overlaps with the nationalist movement, how possible is it to actually get the Kurds the things that they want in order for them to be satisfied within the Turkish Republic?
Well, when you look at the three things, constitutional change is... They will do the constitutional change because Erdogan wants to change the constitution into a presidential system. So when you rewrite the constitution, what is it that the Kurds want in change in the constitution? The Turkish constitution is a very ethnically oriented constitution where it talks about being a Turk. Mm-hmm. Right? And what the Kurds are saying, don't talk about Turks or Kurds or whomever, just eliminate the ethnic component of... That's not that difficult to do. When it comes to cultural rights, the fact of the matter is, in terms of everyday life, they've already achieved that. What they want is to be able to teach their kids in Kurdish in primary school, in high school, to have both languages being taught at the same time, which comes essentially with the third is the evolution of powers. Turkey is a very, very centralized state. The central government decides who becomes a teacher in the smallest of the hamlets in Turkey. The hamlet that has 100 people, if you're going to send a teacher, some official in Ankara, in the Ministry of Education decides. Same thing is true for police, for prosecutors. What the Kurds are suggesting is that let's decentralize, and not just for Kurdish regions. This is good for Izmir, it's good for Istanbul, it's good for Adana. That let people in the regions decide who they want as teachers, as policemen, as prosecutors. Again, it depends how you package it. It's possible.
Okay.
But it runs contrary to how Erdogan envisions his own role in politics and society.
Okay. Denise, recognizing how much time you've spent in Kurdistan, explain to everyone, including me, the conflict with ISIS around Kobani this past summer into the early fall. How the situation in northern Syria, at least we think
Kurdish areas.
Kurdish areas, defeat of ISIS, the battle for Kobani, how that has changed the calculus of Syrian Kurds, and how that has had, if at all, a dynamic effect on Kurds in Iraq.
Sure. And just remind me, before we start this, sorry, I wanted to interject one thing when to go back to the other question.
Which one?
About independence or not. Right now, if we can put this out from the dichotomy of independence or not, because I think it oversimplifies it. And look at the Kurdistan region. I don't necessarily bought modernization theory, we're just a forward-moving process. But right now, there's an alternate governance structure, is what we're calling them, right? You have this in Colombia with the FARC. You have this in wherever else we can find the idea that as these post-authoritarian states break down, and we've seen this in Libya, we don't know what they're going to look like. We know they're not going to look like before the states were. So the Kurdistan region as it is could be some form of alternative governance structure. That's not necessarily a state juridically, but it's certainly going to be more authority than just an entity of a sub-state actor. And I think when we start having to look at the international system, again, the FARC's doing it in Colombia, that this is an entity that other folks in the state can't even enter without a visa. It does have certain authorities, and that possibly could be a third way of looking at the Kurdistan region and other entities like it. Now I want to go back to Stephen's question. Kobani has been, I remember in 1991 when I first went into, and it was nobody there, and you saw the Kurds from Syria, and people were afraid, and they said, those are the PKK people, and even the Iraqi Kurds would run. We were so afraid. And this Kobani, I have to tell you, has been so symbolically moving and mobilizing, even before ISIS came in and there was an onslaught. So even with the movement and the declaration of these autonomous cantons in the Kurdistan region, this has been symbolic, okay, because it's the first time that the Kurds in Syria had some form of quasi-recognition. So it didn't just come with ISIS, it was there beforehand. But what Kobani did is it did mobilize tens and thousands of Kurds, and I mean everywhere. Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey mobilizing on behalf of Kobani. New nationalist myths, new red lines, peace process linked to Kobani. The fact that Turkey let Kobani bleed is what the Kurds say. This is a big issue too. I'll give you the secondary consequences. So one is this vast mobilization of Kurdish nationalism, the symbolism of Kobani now as Kirkuk is to the Kurds, that this has become, and what has happened as a secondary consequence, and this coincides with the coalition, the countering ISIS strategy, is the PYD, PKK, whatever you want to call them, they've gotten semi-recognition. And this is driving many in Turkey crazy. But this has been the real fallout, is that the semi-recognition of the PYD and the PKK has not only emboldened them, but it has given a different type of international status. The PYD folks are going to Europe and meeting with European leaders. So this has changed and affected not only the Kurdish streets, and there's a good way and a good part to this and a not good part to this in terms of the leadership. Because the expectations now on the PYD leadership is, you better deliver. We want a region of our own. Give us services. Why are you trying to cut deals with Arabs? And this has been, by the way, a fallout of the ISIS onslaught, not only in Syria but in Iraq. When I talked about this burning strength of Kurdish nationalism, it's also become xenophobic. Not necessarily, it's linked to ISIS. It's anti-Arab. So it's also blocking some of the Kurdish leaders' ability, even though there's a lot of pragmatic political pacts being constructed at this level. Barzani and Nujafi, militia, PYDs working with the FS, Free Syrian Army. A lot of pragmatic deals that have to be done. But on the streets, there's a lot of reticence, and there's a lot of, I would say, ethnic fault lines being created. This goes with the strengthening of Kurdish nationalism. What it also has done by emboldening the PKK is now they have immediately mobilized to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. I go back to the fragmentations. Just yesterday, they arrested the KDP arrested one of the Yazidi leaders, because who knows what the PKK is trying to now create an autonomous, we call them, canton in Sinjar. It's getting a little messy now. So will the PKK stay in northern Iraq, in the Kurdistan region, with this emboldening of the PKK? So again, Syrian Kurds at this point, their attitude is I don't think they want any less than what they have right now. It's very convenient to say, well, this can turn out like Iraqi Kurdistan because that's an easy thing to do, and I don't think so necessarily. The Iraqi Kurds had more than 20 years of working with the international community, and starting with us in 1992. They have international backing and large international recognition. The Syrian Kurds right now, most of us would probably know, there still is a tacit agreement with the Assad regime. There still is, and they're very clever about it. So it's a revenue for oil, an oil for revenue deal in some way. That when Assad's forces pulled out, they made a deal with the PYD, guard the oil fields, guard the Rumeilian field, which is in Hasaka, and that's a large field right in the heart of the Kurdistan region, and we'll send you money. My Syrian Kurdish friends say their families haven't stopped receiving a salary since the first day of the civil war. So there is a tacit agreement with the Assad regime, and as long as that agreement lasts, this autonomous region is fine. But there's going to have to be some patron to that autonomous region, and there's going to have to be some negotiation. So on the one hand, I go back to this very strong sense of Kurdish nationalism, and the PYD, the PKK, by the way, they really did come out the heroes of this deal.
Well, that's my next question, but who's going to be the patron?
That's right, Stephen. Here's possibly, and that's why in the beginning, do you remember when we had the Syrian National Coalition trying to get the Kurds on board, saying you got to cut a deal with the Sunni Arab community because who's going to support you? So it's either they're going to have to move toward the Sunni Arab community in Syria, either it's going to have to be Damascus in some way, and I see in the future, because I'm cynical, at some point Damascus and Turkey can get back and do to them what they did in 1989. Or they're going to lose this. I mean, remember Mahabad in 1946? I mean, many of these Kurdish republics emerged during war because there was a patron. And then, oops, I forgot, the Russians pulled out, and so did Mahabad.
Right. So I mean, that seems to me a salient difference between the Syrian situation and the Iraqi situation,
Yeah,
where
again,
you can imagine patrons for an independent Kurdistan in Iraq. You can't really imagine viable ones, permanent ones.
Well, it depends. I mean, no.
Syria.
The Iraqi Kurds can have a patron, that will be Turkey, but they'll be a vassal state of Turkey. The Syrian Kurds are going to have to end up cutting a deal with somebody, but at this moment, they don't have nearly the resources. I mean, the Kurdistan region of Iraq was also able to thrive because they were getting about $13 billion a year in revenues.
Okay, 1 second. You've said, I'm going to ask Henri this question based on something that you've said. And then I have one more question, and then we'll throw it open. Denise has said a couple of times, vassal state of Turkey.
I should say client state. I wrote client state.
Doesn't matter, client, vassal. I'm okay with either one. The point is well taken. Here's my question. We have vassal state, client state, yet you just articulated, Henri, quite an amazing story. That on Nevruz, not a Turkish flag, not a Turkish soldier, not a Turkish policeman, not a million people to hear Abdullah Öcalan, who in 1999 everybody was convinced the Turks were going to hang somewhere.
No, they can't hang.
And so how much of a vassal state might Iraqi Kurdistan be if the Turks aren't willing to deal with Kurdish nationalism within the Anatolian rectangle? I mean, Turkey used to be the leading candidate to invade Iraq. Then it was the leading candidate to invest in northern Iraq. Can the Turks accommodate themselves to something more than clientelism, accommodation, whatever, of something called Kurdistan in northern Iraq? In the shorter term rather than the long term. Because everybody always weasels out of it and says, in the long term, of course, there's going to be a Kurdistan.
I know.
No, but listen, I actually do think that the Turks will have to make some kind of a deal with an independent Kurdistan because it will be in their interest to do so. It will be in their interest to do so for two reasons. One, maybe three. One is that the Kurdistan region is, provided it has resources, and I think it will have at some point resources, is an important market for Turkish companies. Two, the Turks need the gas and the oil that will come out from northern Iraq. Northern Iraq has a great deal of gas. Yes, it will be northern Iraq will be dependent on Turkey for exporting its gas, but Turkey will also be dependent on northern Iraq to buy its gas. And we see the same situation, by the way, between Iran and Turkey today. Why do Iran and Turkey get along so well on so many issues, even though they disagree so fundamentally on Syria? Because there is a mutual dependence relationship over gas. But
Spoken like a professor of international relations.
Thirdly, is the soft power that the Kurds in Turkey will be wielding in Turkey, in Turkish politics. And once they've made that accommodation, you will see Kurdish political parties essentially becoming stronger in Turkey, and they will essentially play a role that will mitigate the vassal aspect of that, or the clientelistic relationship. Turkey is much bigger, much more powerful, much richer. Sure, it's a NATO member, it's a candidate, not for long, I think, for the European Union. So it is the relationship. Of course, it will be lopsided, but I think it will be wrong to underestimate the soft power that the Kurds will have in northern Iraq. But the Syria, look, the Kobani question is actually quite interesting in terms of how it has changed the dynamics. And in some ways, even though the Syrian Kurds are diametrically opposed to the Kurds in Iraq, ironically, the defense of Kobani, the success in Kobani, the fact that the American Air Force came in to side with the Kurds has essentially lifted all Kurds at the same time. I used to think that the Syrian Kurds did not have much influence, that eventually the Barzanis would, or the KRG, because it has all the assets, would be able to dominate, and that the Syrian Kurds will look to Iraqi Kurdistan for their own patron relationship. But I think it will be essentially the same relationship that between Turkey and the KRG that you will see between the Syrian Kurds and the Iraqi Kurds. But I think Syria is beyond repair. I mean, let's not forget this. We don't know what's going to emerge, but whatever it is. And by the way, Denise, you said that people are still getting their salaries. Believe it or not, both Iraq and Syrian central governments are still paying the salaries of teachers, of everybody, because they want to maintain that figment of that they still control the territory. So it's not just
it's the whole country.
Okay, this is lightning round, and then we're gonna open it up. I know you want to get into.
No, I have to just make one statement, though. I'm sorry.
I could never stop you, Denise, ever.
But we can't confuse what Turkey does with its own Kurds with when I say the word vassal state. I mean, and it rubs people the wrong way when I say it. Let's just look at the realities right now. This is with the oil gamble. I don't think Turkey's needs and what it takes from Iraqi Kurdistan is the same as what it does with Iran. Iran's a power. Turkey is taking over, 90% of its gas right now from the Iranians. You have to look at what the Iraqi Kurds aren't completely puppets either. That very strong sense that it's not just the Turkey can have this from the Kurds and it'll be a great deal for Turkey. You listen to the Iraqi Kurds, particularly after ISIS, south of Erbil. I strongly suggest people going, so wait a minute, the Turks are going to get our gas for nothing. We don't even know about pricing mechanisms. So do the Kurds themselves, because there's a dignity here, do they want to sell everything that they have to Turkey, which will basically and essentially keep them indebted to them? There's over $2 billion in loans to Turkey right now. They've got their money in the Turkish bank. They don't know when they're going to get all of it. A couple 100,000 barrels in Jahan. Where is the Kurds' leverage? Because at the end of the day, the Iraqi Kurds want to leverage their political interests. When you have one transit route, you are beholden to Turkey. Now, if sanctions get lifted, and if the Iraqi Kurds have a second transit route, right? There's landlocked energy states. We've seen this in the Caspian. No matter how independent you want to become, you become dependent on your transit route. If Iran's sanctions are lifted, now you're talking about a different dynamic. Now you're talking about the Iraqi Kurds can have two official transit routes out, and they're not so beholden to Turkey. But what I'm saying is don't underestimate Iraqi Kurds just running to Turkey because they can sell their gas.
Okay. Now it's really the lightning round. I want in this answer to be as concise as possible. In fact, I just want a name. I want no other explanation. Who is,
Not going to happen.
who, I know,
It's never going to
I
happen.
know, but I had to say it. Who is the most powerful Kurdish leader right now?
Where?
Kurdistan's big place. Who's the most powerful Kurd? Is it Öcalan? Is it President Barzani? Is it Salahuddin Demirtas? Is it Saddam Hussein? Who is it? Who's the most powerful, most influential Kurd right now?
Öcalan.
We got one Öcalan.
And you have, I have
A
to say
name?
it.
Give us a
no,
name.
you can't. It
Yeah, I
depends.
need a name.
Barzani.
Okay.
Öcalan. I can't. You,
You can't?
cannot. Stephen, no, I'm not going to simplify it down to this. The Kurdistan region is huge. It's extremely localized.
Who holds who holds most of the
It
cards
depends
right now?
where. Öcalan and Barzani. It depends where.
You change the parameters by saying by using cards. I mean, the most influential in terms of
People, and it's probably Öcalan. In terms of, if you were
Great.
to
Okay.
put
Yeah.
it this way, if you were to put a whole bunch of Kurds in a room from all the regions of Kurdistan, and this is what they was always told to me, and you had to take a vote, they'd probably all vote for Öcalan.
Okay, good, great. Now it's we have some Kurds here. We can maybe do that afterwards. After we're done live streaming.
But Barzani is important too.
After we're done live streaming. Okay, so now it's open to you. There is a microphone here, but I'm more than happy to call on people. Please.
We do ask to a person.
Oh yes, the microphone because they are doing live stream. So please,
Because you're doing what?
the mic. It does work.
And just introduce yourself, please. All right.
Hi, my name is Samad Zey, and I'm Kurd from Erbil, and I work for Voice of America. And my colleague is also here. He might want a question as well. My question is that President Barzani promised independence, right? It might be not now. He said that plan is still on the agenda. But my question is, what if Barzani doesn't run another term? He himself, just a couple of weeks ago, if not a week ago, said he does not want to run another term. But then 3 weeks ago, there was a fight at the parliament. Yeah, exactly. So does the agenda change if the president changes?
I'm just the moderator here. Who would like to take this?
First of all, he's going to stay. I mean, you know, you're in a war period right now, and I'll be really blunt. If Massoud has to go at some point, you know, it'll be 10 years, and Masroor comes in, I mean, you know, this has been no coincidence that all of these major activities, you know, you'll always see Masroor. He's in training. So I don't think there's going to be a major shift in policy, and Masroor has used some of the much of the discourse that Massoud has done. They have to say this. Do you know a Kurdish leader who can get up on the platform and say, we will never have independence, and still get voted in? They can't even do that anymore. Guran can no longer say, we think that Baghdad, we should negotiate with Baghdad on oil. You have to say it, or you'll lose your seat, right? So I think, though, those promises of we're going to have independence, I'm going to declare a referendum, that's actually worked against them in some ways, because you do have a lot of, let's say, angry people on the street saying, you know, what about our independence? What about that referendum? So, you know, I think, one, that Massoud will be hanging on for a while, and if he doesn't, and if his son does, or another leader who's capable, is going to continue with that same type of discourse.
We were on the edge of, passing a referendum. That's, of course, when Nouri Maliki was
He was the best thing for you guys, by the way.
Henri, do you have a response to this?
Look, I think Massoud is going to be the president. I mean, we've seen other cases. I was trying to remember what presidents who said, "Oh, I'm not going to be,
No.
I'm not going to run," and then, of course, popular support forces them to run again, and because they really don't want to do it. And I think in the case of, there is no other person. Look,
That's right.
you need somebody who is internationally recognized. Somebody, a leader that the rest of the world is comfortable with, and there is no other person. I mean, it isn't that there are incompetent people. I can think of some very good people, including one of my best friends, but I don't think the politics of the region will allow for anybody else but Massoud to emerge.
I agree.
More questions? The floor is open. Please, to the microphone.
Hi, my name is Zephyr. I'm a grad student here at SAS. So my question has two parts.
One part is how big a role do you think the Kurdish diaspora plays in all of this as far as influencing specifically Kurdish semi-independence within Turkey? And the second part is how much influence do you think the European Union might have as well, considering Turkey's desire to join?
So you're focusing on the Kurds in Turkey now?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Henri, I think that's right up your alley.
Look, the European Union has had an enormous influence in terms of allowing a great deal of liberalization in Turkey, especially in terms of pushing the military back into what it should be in the barracks. They didn't do it on their own. I mean, but it's been an influential force. I think Turkish democratization would not have happened without European Union influence. The other thing which European Union has been important is when the issue of the diaspora, because when you look at the Turks who have migrated, Turkish citizens who have migrated over the years to Europe, to Germany to work, you have essentially the same proportion of Turks to Kurds that you see in Turkey. Roughly 20% of the workers in Germany, in France, etc., are Kurds. But in those countries, they found a means of expressing themselves, organizing themselves, and also raising money. And they were very, very influential in terms of helping the PKK get funds. And even though the PKK is a terrorist organization by European standards, there was very little that the European governments could do to stop that. So in that sense, that also the diaspora, you're right, played a very, very important role in maintaining the PKK and making it strong.
Just a quick point. I lived in Europe for about 14 years in France, and to study the diaspora actually, and I did work in England, in Germany, following. So
I remember your lovely apartment in Paris.
Yes,
Very
I still
nice.
have my apartment in Paris. I'm never getting rid of it. So nonetheless, in each of these countries, it's different than the United States. Europe also has, I hate to say this word, but there's Kurdish ghettos in some of these cities. We were trying to trace the diaspora in the United States. We couldn't find them because they integrate. I mean, yes, they're in Tennessee, and yes, they're in, but we've integrated. So you also have this mobilization of ethnic identity because the Kurds, like many other immigrants in Europe, are the other. And I love Europe, but it's far more racist. So one, you had this mobilization potential. Kurdish Institute, Paris, Germany, blah, blah. You had the resources. Then you also had, of course, the European Union's commitment to human rights. So in the United States, there's a Kurdish lobby, and it's strong. The way that they mobilized in Europe was through the human rights issue, right? They don't have lobbies in European governments, although the Brits do in some ways. In the European parliaments, it was to do it through some of these social democratic parties, right, through the leftist parties. Most of those Kurds that migrated to Europe, right, that was the guest worker program in the 1960s. So they were the Alevis in Turkey. They were the communists, the leftists. So you already had this very leftist movement, Kurds, the nature of the Kurds that went to Europe in the first place. I have to tell you, though, when I was tracing the Kurds in Iraq, you could find them, and the Kurds, and then by the way, when you go to these towns, the Kurds are in Iraq are this section, and the Kurds in Turkey are in this section. But the Iranian Kurds were very difficult to find because there were no real Iranian Kurdish organizations. They all joined the Iranian ones, playing musical instruments and doing all these other things. So the European Union itself and the setup, and Henri has alluded to this, was the commitment to human rights, the commitment to all of these issues that they tried to bring forth in. That's the way that the leftist, largely leftist diaspora, and by the way, there's about 1 million Kurds in the diaspora, about 25 to 30 million Kurds. It's hard to, but 1 million in the diaspora, and they were very influential. And they've also been very influential in trying to come back, even to the Kurdistan region, to export their skills, to teach or to do whatever it is. They're very highly educated. And some of these really remarkable communities are in Scandinavian countries. I mean, in those countries, they really maintained, the Kurds in Turkey, the language. It's very rare to find a child of a Kurd in Finland who's not speaking Kurdish as well. That wasn't the case in Germany. So there's another aspect of it, and that was this international Kurdish language effort to standardize the Kurdish language, again, starting in Europe. Sorry.
The KDP's International Relations Department has quite a few people from Tennessee and Dallas, I must say, having met them.
Correct.
Please.
Hi, thank you all. My name is James Siebens. I'm a master's student here. So this is kind of a hard power question. The country that's not on that list is Iran. There's clearly a sort of regional competition going on between Turkey and Iran over the Kurdish region in part, and then also the broader region. Longue durée, right? Sykes-Picot has been a structural source of conflict for a while. This sort of conflagration was maybe predictable, some would argue. But now that there is a conflagration and opportunities for power vacuums, who do you see as filling those vacuums? And is there an opportunity for any imaginable contiguous Kurdish region to emerge from that vacuum?
With Iran?
With it, but given the competition between Iran and Turkey, because, well, for example, in Syria, there may be an opportunity for Turkey to step in and become more territorially ambitious. But who do you see as stepping into the void that's going to be left?
With the void, I'm sorry, the void is where?
In Syria and Iraq.
Look, in Syria, first of all, what the Iranians are trying to do is just preserve the Assad regime. I don't think they have ambitions beyond that. I don't think they can. But the Kurdish politics in some ways is complicated because take the PKK now, which is emerging as actually a very, very important and strong contender in the region. And the PKK has relations with everybody, has figured out a way to get along with everybody. But I just was up in northern Iraq recently, and I went and talked to the leadership of the PKK. And what's interesting to me is two things that they said. One was a number, I mean, I don't know if they were lying to me, but what they said to me about Iranian Kurdish participation now in the PKK because of Kobani, because of what happened in Syria, so that the Iranian Kurds are getting energized for the first time. And this is something that a lot of people had been expecting, and the Iranians had essentially managed to hold the lid. But the other thing they said, which was actually quite interesting, was that they said, look at Iran. Iran always fights its domestic battles abroad. It always takes its own internal problems and tries to resolve them abroad. So Iran, for example, has good relations with one of the Kurdish political parties in the KRG. It maintains its relationship with the PKK. It interferes and intervenes whenever it's necessary in order to protect its own boundaries and its own integrity. And you can see it's doing it elsewhere too, obviously, in the region. So Iranian, and I'm no expert on Iran, but it seems to me that the Iranian foreign policy and the Iranian way of dealing with these issues is very different than the way the Turks and the Syrians and the Iraqis have dealt with in the past. But there is something changing in the regions for sure with respect to the Kurds. And I think the Iranians will not be immune. And how they react to that is going to be quite interesting. And I suspect that you will find the Iranians intervening much more. Now, one thing that was very important was that when Erbil was under attack, the two groups, two forces emerged to protect the KRG. One were the Iranians, because the Turks refused to come in, and the other one was the PKK. The PKK was very decisive in two battles, in Sinjar and in Mahmur, where they turned the tide. But in Erbil, it was more the Iranians than anybody else. So you see that the Iranians are actually being very, very smart in terms of how they play. So, but they too will have to deal with their own Kurdish problem at some point.
Denise.
Yeah. To add, you asked how these powers will deal with it. I want to give you a little anecdote. The Iranians, They're not playing. When we were at track 2 and we had the whole table, we had the Iranians there and a whole group of folks, the Iraqis, and they were talking about this oil export. And there was many groups there. And one representative of the Iranian government stood up and said to the Kurds, don't even think about it. And don't make us choose, because we will always choose Baghdad over you. That does not mean, what does Iran want? It wants to secure its interests, right? So it doesn't want a destabilized Kurdistan region where it can't get its commercial interests. And in those ways, Turkey and Iran are different. But as Henri indicated, June 14th, Mosul came into, ISIS came into Mosul. June 15th, the Iranians were there. And there's not an Iraqi, and the Kurds have said too, Kurds, my friends in Kirkuk, of course Iran was 100% useful. Of course they saved us. Now we have the issue of the Shia militia. The Iranians have moved in 100 kilometers. And now if you look at where they are, the Iranians will say, and again, we've just met with them a couple of months ago, this is not about being sectarian, because there's a whole big fight about, this is just sectarian, you're here to destabilize Iraq, and they'll look this in the eye and said, this has nothing to do about being sectarian. We're not doing anything else that nobody else in the region would do, which is to protect our borders. So we're not going to go into Mosul. They went into Amerli. They went into Diyala. Look at where the Iranians went. They went literally 100 kilometers from the border, and they did secure Iraq's western border, correct? And in Kirkuk, and in some of these other areas. So, you can look at it as they're strategically going to engage in those areas where their either Shia populations are or what they would say is their strategic interest, down to Samarra. But nonetheless, where they're going to be, they're going to be where they can secure their interest. There's a lot of commerce available in the Kurdistan region. And again, there's gas not coming from the Kurdistan region out to Iran. There's gas deals from Iran now being signed to be sent inside the Kurdistan region. That's going to continue for a long time, and I don't see that's not mutually beneficial for the Kurds. But in terms of Iranian Kurds having the opportunities, I would say when the Iranian state, if the Iranian state broke up or weakened, then you'd see some movement. I wouldn't expect to see any movement in Iran before changes in the nature of the state would emerge.
Let me just add one quick thing on this issue. I know I'm the moderator, but I have a thought on this. It was interesting to me to see Prime Minister Erdogan's travel itinerary in the last week to 10 days. Tehran, and then more importantly, Riyadh, which has not really been on great terms with Ankara in at least the last 16 or 18 months. Why was Erdogan suddenly interested in visiting Riyadh, and why has Ankara been so, at least rhetorically, supportive of what's happening in Yemen? That's because of what happened in Tikrit. Now it's getting real. Now the Iranians are starting to get ever closer to Mosul, which was unceremoniously by the British, by the League of Nations, under the pressure of the British, lopped onto Iraq. This is way, way, way too close for comfort. They're perfectly happy to buy gas from the Iranians until they have another source, but there's something about this geopolitics. So I don't know who's going to control these spaces, but there are clearly competitions among these states, and there's an opportunity, it strikes me, on the part of the Kurds to play a role in this in ways that they haven't ever been able to play before. How it comes out in the wash, no one knows, because none of these players have a perfect theory of politics. They're not evil geniuses, nor are they bumbling fools. So I think that I think you're onto something in suggesting that there is really an issue that's important, and that there are going to be these disputed territories where things are going to play out in a variety of different ways, actually.
You know what else has happened in Iraq? And you talked about how these great powers are projecting their interest, this proliferation of militia. This is a new phenomenon, and it's not just the Shia militia, right? So if you talk to people in Kirkuk, you have Shabak militia, Assyrian, Turkoman, Yazidi. This is extremely dangerous. Iraq, some of the Kurds, Iraqis, or Kirkukis are telling me this is like the Lebanization of Iraq. These militias are available for these external powers to buy off. You've had the Yazidi militia is now being accused of taking money from Baghdad. And so, again, I would look at how this proliferation of militia is going to play out in the terms of how external actors can come in and try to buy them and use them, and that could be quite messy as well.
You have a question, sir? Please go to the mic and introduce yourself.
Karwan Zabari with the Kurdistan Regional Government. Dr. Cook, if I may, I just a couple things first, and then I'll ask my question.
Quickly.
Yes.
We're starting to run out of time.
Yes.
So
The fight in parliament, I think that's democracy. How many parliaments in the world have we seen going at each other with punches?
No.
And Japan, a lot of European Union parliaments. President Barzani, running, not running, he's already said today, that was breaking news before coming here, he said, I'm not going to run without any legal precedence unless the parliament, the KRG parliament, does something about it. Denise, you mentioned that if a Kurdish politician was to say no independence, or we're not going to go for independence, he or she would lose his or her seat.
Exactly.
But let me say this. Imagine if a American presidential candidate came up and says, my vision is to increase the American taxes on Americans. How far would that candidate get? It's the same issue. This is the campaign. This is how things work in that region. Let me ask the question here.
Please.
Today's role, the Kurdish role in the fight against ISIS. There's a lot of militias. There's a lot of non-state actors that are popping up in Iraq. What happens to Iraq the day after ISIS? You've got the Kurdish Peshmerga, you've got the Shia-led government militias, you've got Iran-backed militias, you've got the Sunnis, you've got a lot of other ones that are happening. What happens the day after ISIS? If you could please allude to that.
Henri, what happens the day after ISIS?
Well, that's what I said earlier. Defeating ISIS is not going to be enough. And that in that sense, both Syria and Iraq are fundamentally broken. And I think it's putting them back together is going to be almost impossible. Precisely because you have this proliferation of militias, and it's going to be very difficult to curtail them because there's no strong central government that's capable of doing it.
Denise.
I don't want to go into it's either going to break up or it's not going to break up. You're going to have a very weakened state for a very long period of time with different alternative governance structures or ungoverned spaces and people trying to dispute not only the militias, now you have reconciliation at a local level, right? Your neighbors who were once your neighbors were involved in killing each other. So the fact of the matter is, how do you bring in all of these different militias into a single structure? Will a Sunni National Guard really be willing to become part of the Iraqi security forces? That depends, again, what you look at is what is ISIS, right? Again, we had this conversation with large Iraqis, and there wasn't one who didn't recognize that the idea of defeating ISIS is almost ridiculous. And if you look at ISIS just as a bunch of radical Islamists, you're missing the point, that this is embedded in Baathists, the former Baathists, right, and the former Arab radical nationalists. So when you ask that question, what happens after ISIS, I don't think there's going to be an after ISIS. I think there's going to be another name, okay? But certainly, I don't imagine this radical ISIS, post-ISIS, Sunni radical, post-Ba'athist, whatever you want to call them, are certainly going to be at ease with working side by side with the Shia militia. Will they be under the structure of the Iraqi security forces? Possibly. Will they be willing to go fight in Anbar if you're a Shia? I don't think so. So that, again, I don't think it's just to look at, okay, it's not going to be like it was before, therefore it's going to fall apart. No. How is it going to be set up so that we can actually function with this entity called the Kurdistan region in the government in the north and some of these other entities? We don't even know if the Sunni region is going to become a Sunni region and who's going to be the leader, because they'll probably fight with each other over that, right? But the militia issue is enormous, and I don't have the solution other than special entities within their own region under the auspices of the Iraqi security forces.
Okay. No, because there are others who'd like to. You guys can debate this outside. No, please. This is going to be our last. I'm being directed. This will be our last question.
Good afternoon. My name is Elodie Lefeur. I'm a student here at SIS. My question is kind of following what you said about the post-ISIS phase, and I had a very interesting conference yesterday with Colonel Mansour, former military operative in Iraq, telling about his analysis of the rise of ISIS, and he was basically saying that we should use a hybrid force to fight ISIS, including the Kurds. And my question is, what do you think the USA will have as a role with all the countries you evoked? Would there be, if the Kurds help the United States defeating ISIS, would it have how can they have an impact on perhaps the process of negotiations or the power balance between Iraq, Syria, Turkey? How do you think it will work?
Oh, I forgot. By the way, my views are my own and not those of the U.S. government when you said the U.S. government. So I should have said that at the beginning, and I apologize. Are you talking, but the Kurds are fighting as a local coalition partner on the ground right now. So I'm not quite clear of the question.
This is Peter Mansour.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
He was basically saying we should get the Kurds more involved, because it's...
You're talking about heavy weapons, direct supplies? Okay, that's a very, okay, I can't, again, this is my own views, and I'll just express the very complicated issue with that, which is there are Sunni Arabs asking for weapons directly. There's the issue of, what happens, where do the weapons go to? Okay, what happens afterwards? Are you arming a region that wants to become a state? Is it going to be used against? There's a whole host of political, legal questions. I know, my understanding is that parts of DOD, you can't supply non-state actors with weapons at a certain point. There's all of these legal issues, and then there are political issues. So that's probably why, up to this point, when there's been a lot of congressional efforts, or in some parts, to directly arm the Kurds, it hasn't gone through. There's other actors in Iraq who are asking the same questions as well.
Look, if you want the Kurds to fight, you'll have to supply them with heavier arms. They do not have, they have some artillery. In fact, they used it in Kobani. They brought it from northern Iraq through Turkey into, and that was important, but they do not have enough heavy weaponry, especially because ISIS still has fairly large quantities of American-made tanks and artillery. But it seems to me that ultimately, whatever effort that's going to be made is going to be Mosul. At some point, Iraq has to recapture Mosul, because if it doesn't recapture Mosul, Iraq is no longer Iraq. So Mosul is going to be critical, and to get Mosul, you're going to have to bring a huge number of forces to bear on Mosul, and the American Air Force, and everything else that goes with it. So for that, I think they'll have to figure out some way of supplying the KRG with equipment. I don't know how else to do it. But Mosul, look at the critical issue will be the battle for Mosul, which they're not ready yet.
One little second finger. I don't agree for one point. We have to start thinking about secondary consequences. And the secondary consequences could actually have a backlash on the Kurds. Could be perceived as, because this is about getting addressing Sunni Arab grievances. My colleague actually just left a week ago and shook my hand. He says, I will be the commander of the Mosul forces. He was a former general, and he left to command the Mosul operation. It's not about sending more arms to the Kurds to win Mosul. As I said, in my view, this is a deep Ba'athist, former Ba'athist element. What are you going to do, General Najm? I have to speak to my tribe. I have to speak to the former officers. I have to go tell them to join us. Because all of these people I have to now get on board, and they know me. I mean, this is what this was about. And I will come in from this direction. But it's certainly about getting the Sunni Arabs on board. And the dozens and dozens and dozens that we've spoken to have said the same thing. And every Sunni family today, before they were with ISIS, now you've got at least one family member of two who are with ISIS and one is not. And the question is, why are we going to fight ISIS if we don't believe that our future is going to be any better than it was right now, even though Abadi has made some efforts? So if you look at this, this is a political issue, and Mosul's the beating heart of it, because Mosul's the city of a million officers, as we say in Iraq. So getting and disembedding that strong Ba'athist element from it means addressing Sunni Arab grievances, meaning when you over-empower and it's perceived that the balance is favoring one group, there actually is going to be a backlash, and that's against the strategy of addressing Sunni Arab grievances. That's one of the big issues why they're not supplying weapons.
And that's what we have to end on,
Sorry.
unfortunately. So please join me in thanking Denise Natali and Henri Barkey for this extraordinarily interesting session. You know what I just realized? We're all products of the University of Pennsylvania here. Go Quakers. Very nice.
Yeah. You should have said that at the beginning.
I don't think